This hilltop is just south of Salerno, in southern Italy. I'm Matthew Settle. In 71 BC, Rome's legions fought a desperate battle against an army 32,000 strong, led by the gladiator Spartacus. It was not an invasion force they faced, but an army of slaves fighting for their own freedom. Both armies numbered around 32,000 men, but here, all similarities ended. The Romans were led by their wealthiest citizen, Marcus Crassus. This was a battle between the army of the poor and the richest man in Rome. The whole structure of Roman society was at stake. Spartacus had to be stopped at all costs. Now, with new video game technology, you are about to see this great battle as never before. The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. Get the view the generals wished they had, now on Decisive Battles. In 73 BC, 1 out of every 3 people living here in Italy was a slave. That's 2 million slaves serving the needs of 4 million Romans.
A slave under Roman law was considered property. Their life and death depended on their master. They could not testify in court unless they had been tortured. When a master is killed by a slave in the household, all the slaves in the household, innocent or guilty, are to be executed.
If you were unfortunate enough to be a strong, fit slave, you could be forced to fight as a gladiator in the arena. Gladiatorial contests where slaves fought to the death were as popular then as football championships are today. One of the finest gladiator trainers was Lentulus Batiates. His gladiators trained here at Capua. They were the pride of the Rome arena, major league killers. One of them was Spartacus.
Spartacus is a Roman form of a Thracian name. Thrace is roughly modern Bulgaria, and it's a name that was used by some kings up there, so it's not impossible that Spartacus himself was a man of royal background.
He started out as a soldier in the legions, but he deserted, only to be captured along with his wife and sold into slavery. The Roman historian Plutarch tells how his wife had a reputation as a prophetess. When she saw a snake coiled around his neck while he slept, she predicted that he would have great power, but also great misfortune. Spartacus was sent to the city of Capua, about 20 miles from Mount Vesuvius, a dormant volcano in central Italy. And there, alongside 200 other gladiators, he was trained to fight in the arena by whip-wielding instructors. These were the gladiators' quarters beneath the amphitheater. They waited here before being taken up for battle in the arena. The one thing gladiators could be sure of was that they would die sooner or later. They were doomed as soon as they entered the school.
Although they obviously were at risk of their lives every time they went into the arena, nevertheless, they were seen as heroes.
The gladiators became kind of rock stars of their day. We have graffiti in Pompeii saying, "All the girls love the gladiator Paris."
Spartacus wasn't impressed by this adulation and told his fellow gladiators that if they had to fight, they might as well fight for freedom. In 73 BC, they took their chance. He led 200 gladiators as they attempted to break out of the school, armed with weapons they had stolen from the kitchen, chopping knives and spits. 70 of them made it. They raced through the town and stole a consignment of gladiator weapons, which were being transported to other cities. Local soldiers were sent to recapture the escaped slaves, but they stood no chance against the highly trained gladiators. They were quickly killed and routed. They moved south towards Mount Vesuvius, a volcano which had been dormant for generations, and made their camp here on its lower slopes. Along the way, they plundered plantations and liberated slaves. Many gladly joined the rebel gladiators. Rome finally had to intervene and sent an army of 3,000 men to quell the rebellion. Its commander, Claudius, was sure of success. He cornered the gladiators on a hilltop near Vesuvius, but this part of the slope was covered in vines. Spartacus ordered his men to cut the vines and make ropes out of them. In the dead of the night, they quietly lowered themselves down a cliffside and surprised the Roman troops by attacking from behind. The gladiators took no prisoners. Their fighting skills, honed by weeks of training, made short work of the Roman soldiers who panicked and fled. Spartacus looted the Roman camp, making off with more weapons, weapons with which he could arm more slaves.
How do slaves arm themselves? They beat forces that are sent against them and take their weapons, attract more followers, and so it becomes like a snowball rolling downhill.
Runaway slaves was a continual problem. They were tattooed. They wore little collars that said, "I am so-and-so slave," in case they were caught.
Spartacus' successes had inspired them. Thousands escaped to his camp. Soon he had an army of 70,000 men.
The army is made up of a huge diversity of nationalities. Thracians, Gauls, Spanish, Africans, different languages, different cultures. Spartacus must have been an extremely charismatic individual to be able to weld together this polyglot force.
A second Roman force of 6,000 men was sent against him. But Spartacus and his slave army defeated that as well. The entire social order was in meltdown. For every Roman citizen, this was their worst nightmare come true. Spartacus had to be stopped at any cost, or the masters would soon become the slaves. It's 73 BC, and an army of slaves and gladiators is challenging the might of Rome. Spartacus spent the winter in southern Italy, but as soon as spring arrived, he ordered his army north. He had now nearly 100,000 men. Most of his slave army came from Gaul and Germany. His aim was to march up through Italy and cross the Alps and return his troops to their homelands.
He and many of his followers simply want to get out of Italy. They want to go back whence they came. They want to go back to their old life.
There was little to stop him. Virtually all of Rome's legions and experienced generals were on duty on the frontiers of the empire. For the time being, any army he fought would be a makeshift affair, composed largely of conscripts.
The Romans, of course, had most nightmares about an enemy in Italy itself. They were thinking back, I'm sure, many generations to Hannibal and how he had been able to rampage through Italy unchecked. Now, it was even worse in that the slaves were doing this and the Roman armies were all overseas.
As he moved north, Spartacus swept aside every force the Romans sent against him. But he was having trouble with his own huge army. The leader of the Gauls, Crixus, disagreed with Spartacus. He wanted to stay and plunder Italy rather than cross the Alps. And he broke away with thousands of his followers. But once he separated from Spartacus, Crixus was attacked by another Roman army. The Gauls fought well and forced the Romans to retreat.
But unfortunately, this force of Gauls celebrates too soon. The men get into a drunken stupor, the Roman force hasn't been utterly defeated, they come back and kill the Gauls while they're lying there drunk.
20,000 Gauls, including their leader, Crixus, were killed. When news of this reached Spartacus, he responded by giving the Romans a taste of their own medicine. He forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight in pairs, like gladiators, to the death. Spartacus swept on northwards, but when the Alps were almost in sight, his way was blocked at Mutina by the 2 legions of Cassius Longinus, the Roman governor of the region. But the 10,000 legionaries were heavily outnumbered and crushed by the slave army.
I think it's quite easy to see, in hindsight, that the Romans grossly underestimated Spartacus and his forces.
Since the revolt began, Spartacus had not lost a single battle. He must have thought no one could stop him. He had not counted on his own army. The Alps and freedom were now a short march away, but when he urged his army on, they refused to go any further. They hadn't lost a single battle. Now they wanted to stay and ravage Italy. Reluctantly, he turned his army, now nearly 100,000 strong, and headed south. Rome shuddered at the thought that their slaves were now their masters on the battlefield.
The nightmare, of course, is the enemy within. These people are literally in your own house, in your own rooms, taking care of you. It really is the idea that the enemy is all around you, and this must have had a tremendously corrosive effect upon people's sense of security.
At that very moment, Rome decided that only a large army and a determined general could stop Spartacus. 6 new legions were added to the 4 already in Italy, 50,000 men. Marcus Crassus was given command. Ruthlessly ambitious and fabulously wealthy, he saw the defeat of Spartacus as the way to political power. Now was the time to make his mark.
Crassus surrounded himself with his friends, his allies politically. He wanted people to know how successful he was going to be. And he was determined to be very successful.
Crassus shadowed the slave army as it moved south. He planned to keep Spartacus moving south and then hem him in, down on the heel of Italy.
Spartacus is wandering up and down Italy, north of Rome, south of Rome. Quite extraordinary, the geographical range, the freedom. So Crassus got to pin the guy down.
He instructed his commanders to avoid battle. But one of them, Mummius, could not resist the chance for glory. He sent his 2 legions against Spartacus, just south of Naples. Once again, the slaves and gladiators inflicted heavy casualties and sent the Romans off in humiliating defeat. Crassus was furious. The defeated soldiers suffered a terrible punishment, decimation. Crassus chose a cohort of soldiers who had fought badly and made an example of them. 480 men. They were lined up, and every 10th soldier was stabbed or beaten to death by his own comrades.
We're told that this improved the morale of the other Roman forces, which tells us something about the way the Romans thought about war, as well as about the ruthlessness of Crassus.
Presumably, it focused the attention of the others on their next battle.
The Roman soldiers realized they had more to fear from their commanders than the enemy, and discipline was restored. The Roman legions tracked Spartacus as he moved further and further south. By the beginning of 71 BC, Spartacus was in Bruttium, in the toe of Italy. But he was determined not to be pinned in there by Crassus. He planned to board ship and sail to Sicily, where there was a large slave population. Safety was just 5 miles away. But Crassus was hot on his heels and determined to wipe out the slave army once and for all. 71 BC. The Roman general Crassus has Spartacus and his slave army cornered in the heel of Italy. The only ships available to Spartacus were owned by pirates from Cilicia in southern Turkey. They had promised to take him and his army to Sicily. Somewhere around here, he waited and waited, but they never came. Betrayed by the pirates, some of the men tried building rafts. But they were useless against the strong currents. Sicily is just right over there, 5 miles across the straits. But to Spartacus, it must have seemed a world away. Now Crassus closed in with an army of 32,000 men. He ordered his troops to build a ditch and a wall across Brutium from one coast to the other. It was 40 miles long. When it was completed, Spartacus was trapped. But Rome did not place all her hopes in Crassus. The great general Pompey had won many victories in Spain. Now, he and his legions were recalled back to Italy. And another general, Lucullus, was sailing with his army from Macedonia and would soon land at Brundisium. Crassus would have preferred to starve out Spartacus over the winter, but Pompey was on his way back to Italy. If he did not win a quick victory, Pompey might march against Spartacus, and Crassus's chance for glory would be gone. Spartacus, too, saw that it was now or never. He tried to negotiate with Crassus, but he refused. In defiance, Spartacus had a captured legionary crucified in full view of the Roman camp. The slave army that had never been defeated now had its back against the wall. Spartacus had to break out. He led his troops in several ferocious attacks on the Roman lines. At last, he managed to break through, but with only 1/3 of his men. He could not escape by sea and had no choice but to head north. Crassus followed and attacked Spartacus again. The gladiators knew that they had to win or die. They were defeated, and 12,000 lost their lives.
One of the things we see again and again is that Rome's opponents do better when they do not fight fixed battles. Spartacus was a great guerrilla leader, but if he had to fight in a formal military context, his slaves simply didn't have the discipline to confront a Roman legion.
Spartacus struggled on with what was left of his army, Crassus in hot pursuit. In a desperate bid to gain the upper hand, Spartacus turned and attacked him at the river Scylla. He killed his own horse to show his men there could be no retreat. The fighting was heavy, but the outcome was never in doubt. Spartacus made straight for Crassus and killed 2 of his centurions before he was cut down himself. The slave army no longer had the numbers to overwhelm the discipline of the legions. The remaining 35,000 rebels were defeated. The body of Spartacus was never found. Around 5,000 slaves escaped, but they ran straight into Pompey's army, which had just arrived from Spain. They were all killed or captured.
Pompey was one of these men who could sniff out a bit of glory from a long distance. And although he really didn't take part in the decisive battle, he did capture about 5,000 of the runaway slaves and put them to death. And he got to Rome and took credit for the whole victory.
Crassus was furious.
What Pompey did was to attempt to steal the glory from Crassus by making out that but for him, the Spartacus rebellion would have continued.
For this and his victories in Spain, Pompey was given a full triumphal procession. But Crassus was only given an ovation, a lesser honor, for his victory had merely been over slaves. But he made sure Rome would remember him. He had captured 6,000 slaves and gladiators alive. Now he used them to underline his victory. This is the Via Appia, the main road into Rome. Crassus had all 6,000 men crucified and their crosses placed at 40-yard intervals along the roadside. The bodies were never taken down. For years afterwards, all travelers along this road could see the revenge of Rome. But nothing could destroy the memory of Spartacus, the gladiator who led slaves against their masters and became a symbol for resistance that still endures today.